History is written by the victors. But what about those caught in between? What about those who survive by adapting, translating, negotiating? For 500 years, one woman has been called the ultimate traitor to her people, blamed for the fall of the Aztec Empire, condemned as a sellout, her name used as a curse word in Mexico even today. Malinchista means traitor, betrayer of your own people. But what if everything we've been told about her is wrong? What if she wasn't a traitor, but a survivor? What if she wasn't a willing collaborator, but an enslaved woman using the only weapons she had? Her languages, her intelligence, her will to live. Meet Malinche, born Malinali around 1500 CE in the region that would become Mexico. Sold into slavery as a child, given as a gift to Spanish conquistadors, became the translator who stood between two worlds during one of history's most devastating cultural collisions. She's been called a traitor, a temptress, a villain. But modern historians are finally telling a different story. The story of a woman with no good choices, making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. Today, we're rewriting the narrative. We're looking beyond the propaganda, beyond the colonial myths, beyond the simplistic judgments. We're asking, who was the real Malinche? What were her actual choices? And why does her story matter so urgently right now, 5 centuries later? Because her story isn't just about the past. It's about power, language, survival, and how history treats women who refuse to disappear. Malinche was born Malinali Tenepatl around 1500 or 1502, in the town of Painala, in the province of Coatzacoalcos, on the Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico. She was born into nobility. Her father was a cacique, a local ruler, which meant she grew up with privilege, education, and status. But when her father died, her mother remarried, and everything changed. Her mother and stepfather had a son, and suddenly young Malinali became a problem. She was the rightful heir, the daughter of the first marriage, the one with legitimate claim to inheritance and power. So her own mother made a horrific decision. She sold her daughter into slavery. To cover up this act, they told everyone that Malinali had died. They even held a fake funeral, using the body of another child. Meanwhile, the real Malinali, probably only 8 to 12 years old, was sold to Mayan slave traders. Imagine being a child, ripped from everything you know, told you're dead to your own family, sold like property. She was trafficked through various hands, eventually ending up in Tabasco, in Mayan territory. There, she learned Chontal Maya, adding it to her native Nahuatl. She lived as a slave for years, her noble birth erased, her identity stripped away. Then in 1519, everything changed again. Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés arrived on the coast. The local Tabasco Maya fought them briefly, then sued for peace. And as part of their tribute to these strange, bearded foreigners, with their metal armor and terrifying horses, they gave them 20 enslaved women. One of them was Malinali. She was probably about 17 years old. She had been enslaved for nearly a decade, and she was about to become one of the most controversial figures in Western Hemisphere history. When Malinali was given to the Spanish along with 19 other enslaved women, the conquistadors didn't immediately recognize her value. The women were baptized, forced conversion to Christianity, and given Spanish names. Malinali became Marina. They were distributed among Cortez's captains as slaves, servants, and sexual property. Marina was initially given to Alonso Hernandez Puertocarrero, one of Cortez's officers. But then Cortez discovered something crucial. Marina spoke Nahuatl, the language of the powerful Aztec Empire that controlled most of central Mexico. The Spanish had another translator, Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spanish priest who had been shipwrecked years earlier and learned Chontal Maya. but he didn't speak Nahuatl. So a translation chain was established. Nahuatl speakers would talk to Marina in Nahuatl. She would translate to Maya for Aguilar, and he would translate to Spanish for Cortez. This was tedious and imperfect. But Marina was brilliant. Within months, she had learned Spanish directly, eliminating the need for Aguilar and becoming Cortez's indispensable translator, advisor, and cultural interpreter. The Nahua people called her Malinche, the suffix "sin" being a respectful honorific. The Spanish couldn't pronounce it, and called her Malinche, and soon, they called Cortez himself El Malinche, the captain of Malinche, because she was always at his side, speaking for him, negotiating for him, explaining him to the indigenous peoples they encountered. Think about what this means. An enslaved teenage girl became so valuable that the conquistador leader was named after her, not the other way around. She became Cortez's translator, his strategic advisor, his cultural consultant, his negotiator, and yes, his concubine, bearing him a son. But let's be clear, she had no choice in this. She was enslaved. Any sexual relationship with her captor was rape by definition, no matter how history romanticizes it. As Cortez marched inland toward Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire, Malinche became far more than a translator. She became a strategic intelligence asset. Here's what most people don't understand about the fall of the Aztec Empire. It wasn't just about Spanish military superiority, or even European diseases, though both played devastating roles. It was about indigenous politics. The Aztec Empire wasn't a unified nation. It was a tributary empire built on conquest and subjugation. The Mexica people, what we call Aztecs, ruled from Tenochtitlan, but they had violently conquered and dominated dozens of other indigenous peoples. The Totonacs, the Tlaxcalans, the Cholulans, and many others. These subject peoples were forced to pay tribute, provide warriors, and offer human sacrifices to Aztec gods. They hated Aztec rule. They were looking for any opportunity to break free. Malinche understood this. She spoke their languages, knew their cultures, and recognized their grievances. As Cortez's delegation traveled, she didn't just translate words. She translated cultural context, political dynamics, religious beliefs, and strategic opportunities. When they reached Tlaxcala, a powerful city-state that had fiercely resisted Aztec domination, Malinche helped negotiate an alliance. She explained Spanish intentions, mediated cultural misunderstandings, and helped forge the coalition that would ultimately march on Tenochtitlan. Some historians argue she actively encouraged these alliances, seeing the Spanish as potential liberators from Aztec oppression. Though liberators is a tragically ironic word, given what Spanish colonialism would bring. Others argue she simply translated what Cortez told her to say, with no agency of her own. The truth is probably more complex. She was an enslaved woman navigating impossible circumstances, using her intelligence to survive, making strategic calculations about which master might be marginally less terrible. She warned Cortez about Aztec military tactics, explained religious rituals and political hierarchies, and provided intelligence that shakes Spanish strategy at every turn. One of the most controversial moments in Malinche's story is the massacre at Cholula in 1519. As the Spanish-Tlaxcalan alliance marched toward Tenochtitlan, they passed through Cholula, a sacred city and important Aztec ally. The Cholulans welcomed them, but according to Spanish accounts, Malinche discovered a plot. The Cholulans were planning to ambush and massacre the Spanish forces, on orders from the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma. The sources say an elderly Cholulan woman befriended Malinche and warned her, either out of genuine concern or hoping to save her from the planned attack. Malinche reported this to Cortez. What happened next was horrific. Cortez ordered a preemptive strike. Spanish forces and their Tlaxcalan allies slaughtered thousands of unarmed Cholulan civilians, men, women, children. The city was burned. It was one of the bloodiest massacres of the conquest. For centuries, Malinche has been blamed for this. She's portrayed as the betrayer who exposed the plot, enabling the massacre. But let's examine this critically. Was there actually a plot? Or was it Spanish paranoia and propaganda to justify unprovoked violence? We don't know, we only have Spanish sources. If there was a plot, was Malinche wrong to warn Cortés? If she hadn't, and the Spanish had been ambushed, she would have been killed too. If she had stayed silent and let the Spanish die, would that have saved indigenous lives in the long run? Or would other conquistadors have come with even more violence? These are impossible questions. This is the moral complexity of Malinche's position. She was enslaved, she had no power, and she was forced to make choices where every option led to violence and death. To call her a traitor suggests she had loyalty options available to her. But loyalty to whom? The Aztecs, who would have enslaved or sacrificed her as readily as anyone else. The Tlaxcalans, who were using the Spanish for their own liberation? The Spanish who enslaved and raped her? She had no good choices, only survival. In November 1519, Cortés's forces entered Tenochtitlan as guests of the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II. The city was magnificent, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, with massive pyramids, floating gardens, and a population larger than most European cities of the time. Malinche stood beside Cortés as he met Moctezuma. Translating the encounter between two worlds, tensions escalated. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage. The Spanish massacred noble Aztecs during a religious festival. The Aztecs rose in rebellion. Moctezuma was killed, either by his own people or by the Spanish. Sources conflict. The Spanish were driven out of Tenochtitlan in June 1520, during what they called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, when hundreds of conquistadors and thousands of their indigenous allies were killed. But Cortés regrouped, with Malinche's continued linguistic and strategic support. He assembled an even larger coalition of indigenous allies who wanted to end Aztec power. They laid siege to Tenochtitlan for 93 days, cutting off food and water, while smallpox ravaged the city. In August 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The great Aztec Empire collapsed, and Malinche was there for all of it, translating, negotiating, surviving. After the conquest, Cortés continued to use Malinche for diplomatic missions, including an expedition to Honduras. She bore him a son, Martín Cortés, who is often called one of the first mestizos, people of mixed European and indigenous heritage. But by 1524, Cortés's wife arrived from Spain, and Malinche was no longer useful to him. He married her off to one of his soldiers, Juan Jaramillo. She had a daughter with him, Maria. And then, around 1527 or 1528, Malinche disappears from the historical record. She was probably only 26 or 27 years old. We don't know how, when, or where she died. She simply vanishes, used up and discarded by history. After her death, Malinche's legend grew, but not in her favor. Spanish colonial chronicles portrayed her as a faithful servant who helped bring Christianity and civilization to the savage New World. But in Mexican national consciousness, she became something far darker, the ultimate traitor. As Mexico struggled for independence from Spain in the 19th century and forged a national identity in the 20th century, Malinche became a symbol of betrayal. The very word Malinchista entered the Spanish language as an insult, meaning someone who prefers foreign culture over their own. A traitor to their people, a sellout. The Mexican Nobel laureate Octavio Paz wrote about the La Chingada, the violated mother figure, linking Malinche to national trauma, violated womanhood, and the original sin of mestizaje, racial mixing. Feminist Chicana writers later challenged this, arguing that Paz and other male intellectuals were scapegoating a raped, enslaved woman for male violence and conquest. Malinche was blamed for the fall of the Aztec Empire, as if an enslaved teenage girl was responsible for European imperialism, superior military technology, epidemic disease, and the political fractures within Mesoamerica that made conquest possible. She was blamed for being raped, for bearing a conquistador's child, for surviving when perhaps she was supposed to nobly die instead. This is what patriarchal history does to women. It gives them impossible choices, then condemns them for whatever choice they make. If Malinche had refused to translate, she would have been killed, and another enslaved woman would have been forced to take her place. If she had tried to sabotage the Spanish, she would have been tortured and executed. Her actual crime, in the eyes of history, was surviving. It was being visible. It was being remembered. And for 500 years, she's been punished for it. But in the last few decades, something remarkable has happened. Historians, anthropologists, and especially Indigenous and feminist scholars have begun rewriting Malinche's story. They're asking different questions and challenging the colonial narratives that vilified her. Modern scholars point out that we have almost no sources from Malinche herself, no letters, no testimonies, no direct voice. Everything we know about her comes from Spanish conquistadors writing propaganda to justify their actions, or from later Mexican nationalists using her as a scapegoat for conquest. What if we center her perspective? What if we recognize her as an enslaved woman with no agency, no choices, no power? What if we see her not as a traitor, but as a survivor using the only resources she had, her languages and her intelligence, to stay alive in circumstances of extreme violence? Scholar Camilla Townsend argues that Malinche likely saw herself as Nahua, but specifically not Mexica, Aztec. She was from a different ethnic group that had also suffered under Aztec imperialism. Her betrayal of the Aztecs might not have felt like a betrayal at all to her. Feminist scholars note the profound misogyny in blaming a raped, enslaved woman for the actions of her captors and rapists. Chicana writers have reclaimed Malinche as a symbol not of betrayal, but of survival, adaptation, and the complex identity of being caught between cultures. There's also growing recognition that without indigenous allies like the Tlaxcalans, who made their own strategic calculations about overthrowing Aztec rule, the Spanish conquest would have been impossible. Malinche wasn't the cause of conquest. She was one small player in much larger political, military, and epidemiological forces. This reinterpretation matters because it reflects our own moment. Movements for indigenous rights, feminist reclamation of historical women, challenges to colonial narratives, and recognition of how empire scapegoats the vulnerable for systemic violence. Today, Malinche is everywhere in Mexican and Chicano culture, but her meaning is fiercely contested. In traditional Mexican nationalism, she remains the traitor, the violated mother, the symbol of conquest and shame. But in Chicano and feminist movements, she's been reclaimed as a survivor, a translator between worlds, a woman making impossible choices. Artists have reimagined her, not as a temptress or traitor, but as a powerful figure, navigating between cultures, languages, and identities. The writer Gloria Anzaldúa wrote about Malinche's tongue, the power of language and translation as tools of survival and resistance. Playwright Cherry Moraga created works centering Malinche's voice and agency. Visual artists have depicted her as a strong, knowing figure, rather than a passive victim or seductive villain. She's become a symbol of mestiza identity, the mixing of indigenous and Spanish heritage that defines much of Latin America. but reclaimed from shame to acknowledge complexity. She represents linguistic code switching, cultural adaptation, strategic survival, and the experience of women caught between patriarchal systems where every choice is punished. There's also been growing recognition of her as one of history's great translators and interpreters, not just of words, but of entire worldviews, cultural systems, and political realities. Without her linguistic genius, the encounter between Spain and Mesoamerica would have been even more violent and chaotic. Some scholars even argue she should be recognized as a diplomat and cultural broker, not just a translator. Someone who shaped the encounter between civilizations through her strategic intelligence. The conversation about Malinche is urgent right now because it connects to contemporary debates about immigration, border crossing, cultural identity, language politics, and how we treat people, especially women, and especially indigenous women, who exist between nations, cultures, and languages. Her story asks, what does it mean to be loyal? Who deserves our judgment? How do we survive empire? So who was the real Malinche? The truth is, we'll never fully know. We have fragments, biased sources, propaganda, and myth. But here's what we can say with certainty. She was an indigenous woman born into nobility, betrayed by her own family, sold into slavery as a child, trafficked through different indigenous groups, given as property to Spanish conquistadors, enslaved and raped, forced to serve as translator during one of history's most violent cultural collisions, and then discarded and erased when she was no longer useful. She survived by using her intelligence, her linguistic gifts, and her strategic mind. She had no good choices, only impossible ones. And for 5 centuries, she's been blamed for conquest, colonialism, and the fall of empires, as if an enslaved teenage girl was responsible for forces far beyond her control. Rewriting her story isn't about making her a hero or a villain. It's about recognizing her humanity. It's about seeing the choices she actually had versus the choices history pretends she had. It's about challenging narratives that blame raped, enslaved women for the violence of empires and conquistadors. Malinche's legacy lives in every person navigating between cultures, every translator mediating between worlds, every survivor using intelligence and adaptation to endure violence they can't escape. Her story reminds us that history is written by the powerful, and the powerless are either erased or made into villains. But when we look closer, when we center different voices, when we challenge colonial narratives, different truths emerge. Malinche, Marina, Malinche, translator, survivor, symbol, scapegoat, and finally, perhaps, simply a woman trying to survive an impossible world, a woman who deserves to be seen clearly, judged fairly, and remembered truthfully. Her story isn't just about the past. It's about how we see survivors, how we judge women with impossible choices, and how we rewrite history to tell more honest, more human, more complex truths. 500 years later, Malinche still has something to teach us. Are we finally ready to listen?